Have you ever wondered why some people can't let go of the past? Why they turn their pain into weapons and their love into chains? Today we're diving deep into one of the most psychologically complex characters ever written. Severus Snape. The man who loved so deeply it destroyed him. The wounded lover who taught us that sometimes the most dangerous person isn't the one who hates you, but the one who can't stop loving someone else. This isn't just a character study. This is a psychological breakdown of trauma, obsession, and the shadow self that lurks in all of us. Let me ask you something. When you think about Severus Snape, what do you feel? Sympathy? Disgust? Confusion? That's exactly what makes him brilliant. Because Snape exists in that uncomfortable gray zone where hero psychology meets villain psychology. Where love becomes pathology. And today we're going to dissect exactly why his mind works the way it does, using Jungian psychology, depth psychology, and behavioral psychology to understand the wounded lover archetype. So if you've ever felt stuck in the past, if you've ever wondered why some people can't move forward, this video is for you. Let's begin. Severus Snape was born into hell. Not the magical kind. The mundane, soul-crushing kind that millions of children experience every day. Picture this: a small dark house on Spinner's End. A father who drinks and rages. A mother who's given up. And a boy who learns very early that the world is a cruel place where no one is coming to save you. This is where the wound begins. In Jungian analysis, we understand that our deepest psychological patterns form in childhood. Carl Jung himself talked about how the unconscious mind records every trauma, every rejection, every moment where we learn we're not safe. For Snape, safety didn't exist. Home was a war zone. School would soon become another battlefield. And in the middle of all this darkness, there was Lily Evans. Now here's where it gets interesting from a psychological theory perspective. Lily wasn't just a friend to young Severus. She became his entire emotional support system. His only source of validation. His proof that he was worthy of love. Do you see the problem already? When one person becomes your everything, when your entire sense of self-worth depends on their approval, you've created a psychological time bomb. This is what depth psychology calls enmeshment. Snape didn't just love Lily. He needed her to survive emotionally. She was the light in his darkness, yes, but she was also his addiction. His oxygen. And like any addiction, losing her would nearly kill him. But let's rewind. Why did Snape attach so intensely to Lily? Behavioral psychology gives us the answer. Intermittent reinforcement. Lily showed him kindness in an environment of cruelty. She validated him when everyone else rejected him. She saw potential in him when he saw only worthlessness. This created what psychologists call a trauma bond. Snape's developing brain learned, Lily equals safety, acceptance, survival. Everyone else equals danger. This binary thinking, this splitting, is a classic defense mechanism in people who experience childhood trauma. You divide the world into all good and all bad because nuance feels too dangerous. Lily became the all-good object. And when she eventually rejected him, his psychological world collapsed. Think about this for a moment. Have you ever met someone who idealizes a past relationship? Who can't stop talking about the one who got away? That's exactly what happened to Snape, but amplified to a pathological degree. Because it wasn't just romantic rejection. It was the loss of his only emotional anchor. His only evidence that he deserved to exist. And here's the brutal truth that psychological trauma research shows us. When your entire identity is built around one person, losing them doesn't just break your heart. It shatters your sense of self. You don't know who you are anymore without them. Now we arrive at the moment that defines everything. That terrible word. Mudblood. The slur that ended their friendship forever. On the surface, it looks like Snape showed his true colors, right? That he was always a bigot and Lily finally saw it. But let's go deeper. Let's look at the shadow psychology at work here. Carl Jung taught us about the shadow self, that part of our psyche that contains everything we reject about ourselves. Our anger, our shame, our self-hatred. For Snape, the shadow was enormous. Years of abuse, poverty, humiliation, powerlessness, all of it festering in his unconscious mind. And when James Potter humiliated him in front of the entire school, when Lily witnessed him at his most vulnerable and pathetic, something snapped. This is what psychologists call emotional flooding. His nervous system went into complete overwhelm. Fight or flight. And he fought back with the most devastating weapon he had. Words designed to hurt. But here's the tragedy. He didn't just hurt Lily. He destroyed himself. Because in that moment of shadow eruption, he confirmed his deepest fear, that he was unworthy of love. That he was the monster everyone always said he was. This is the wound of the wounded lover archetype. They destroy the very thing they love most because deep down they don't believe they deserve it. It's self-sabotage rooted in shame. Have you ever pushed away someone who cared about you because you didn't feel worthy? That's the wounded lover speaking. Let's talk about what happened next, because this is where Snape's psychology becomes truly dark. Lily married James Potter. She had a child. She built the life that Snape dreamed of having with her. And Snape? He joined the Death Eaters. Now, most people see this as proof that Snape was evil all along. But through the lens of psychological disorders and personality analysis, we see something else. We see a man in complete psychological freefall. When people experience profound loss and have no healthy coping mechanisms, they often spiral into extremism. They join cults. They embrace ideologies that give them a sense of power and belonging. The Death Eaters offered Snape exactly what he'd always lacked: acceptance, power, and a framework to understand his pain. Pureblood supremacy told him, "You're not worthless because of personal failure, you're special, you're superior, the system is rigged against you." This is textbook radicalization psychology. Find vulnerable people, validate their pain, give them enemies to blame, offer them power and purpose. Snape was the perfect recruit. Traumatized, rejected, full of rage, desperate for significance. And here's the uncomfortable truth: he was good at being a Death Eater. He was intelligent, skilled, ruthless when needed. For perhaps the first time in his life he felt powerful. But then came the prophecy. The moment when Voldemort decided that Lily Potter had to die. And suddenly all that power meant nothing. Because the one person who still mattered to him was about to be murdered. And it was partially his fault for bringing the prophecy to Voldemort in the first place. This is where we see the psychological patterns of guilt and shame diverge. Guilt says, "I did something bad." Shame says, "I am bad." Snape lived in shame. And when Lily died despite his desperate attempts to save her, that shame became his entire identity. Now, from a Jungian psychology perspective, what Snape should have done was integrate his shadow. Accept his mistakes, grieve his losses, and gradually rebuild a sense of self that wasn't dependent on Lily's existence. That's the path to psychological healing. But Snape took a different path. He chose what psychoanalysis calls repetition compulsion. He locked himself into a pattern of endless atonement, dedicating his entire life to protecting Lily's son while simultaneously resenting him. This is the psychology of the wounded lover. Unable to move forward, forever circling the wound. Let's analyze Snape's treatment of Harry Potter, because this is where his psychology reveals itself most clearly. On the surface, Snape is cruel to Harry for no reason. He bullies him, humiliates him, shows obvious favoritism to Slytherin students. What? Simple answer: he hated James Potter and Harry looks just like him. But the psychological reality is far more complex. What we're seeing is a defense mechanism called projection. Snape projects onto Harry everything he hates about himself. His powerlessness. His inability to save Lily. His jealousy. His rage at James for winning the life he wanted. But here's the deeper layer. Harry also has Lily's eyes. Those eyes that Snape loved. Those eyes that haunt him. So every time Snape looks at Harry, he experiences simultaneous attraction and repulsion. Love and hate. Protection and destruction. This is what psychologists call ambivalence, and it's psychologically exhausting. Think about the mental health patterns this creates. Snape spends nearly 2 decades in a constant state of internal conflict. Protecting someone he resents. Serving someone he despises in Dumbledore. Playing a role where no one can know his true loyalties. This is called identity fragmentation in psychological theory. His authentic self, whatever that even means anymore, is buried under layers of performance, secrets, and unprocessed grief. He can't be honest with anyone. He can't form real connections. He lives in perpetual isolation because the wounded lover archetype believes, if people really knew me, they would reject me like Lily did. So better to keep everyone at a distance. Better to be feared than vulnerable. Better to be alone than abandoned again. Now let's address the big question. Was Snape's double agent work heroic or just elaborate self-punishment? From a character analysis perspective, we have to ask, what was his motivation? He tells Dumbledore, "I want to protect Lily's son." But is that love or guilt? Is that redemption or masochism? Psychological trauma research shows us that people with unresolved trauma often seek dangerous situations as a form of unconscious self-harm. They don't believe they deserve safety or happiness, so they put themselves in positions where suffering is guaranteed. Snape became a spy knowing he could be discovered and killed at any moment. He lived in constant danger for nearly 2 decades. Is that bravery or is that a slow suicide driven by shame? Here's the shadow psychology truth: it's both. Human motivation is never pure. Snape protected Harry partly out of love for Lily, yes, but also out of crushing guilt. Out of a desperate need to prove he wasn't the monster he believed himself to be. Out of a hope, maybe unconscious, that somehow this suffering would earn him redemption. That if he paid a high enough price, maybe he could forgive himself. But here's what depth psychology teaches us. Redemption doesn't work that way. You can't earn self-forgiveness through suffering. You can't love yourself into wholeness by serving others while hating yourself. Snape never did the internal work. He never processed his trauma. He never integrated his shadow self. He just kept bleeding and called it love. Let's examine what Carl Jung called the process of individuation. It's the psychological journey toward wholeness, where you integrate all parts of yourself, light and dark, into a coherent identity. Snape never individuated. He remained fractured his entire life. Part of him was still the abused child on Spinner's End. Part of him was still the rejected teenager watching Lily choose someone else. Part of him was the Death Eater who got people killed. Part of him was the protector trying to save Harry. But these parts never came together into a whole person. They just coexisted in painful contradiction. And this is the tragedy of the wounded lover archetype. They're so busy serving their wound that they never actually heal it. Think about Snape's request to Harry in his final moments. Look at me. He wants Harry to see Lily's eyes one last time. Even in death he can't let go. Even at the end his last thought is of her. Now, some people find this romantic. The idea of loving someone so completely that decades and death can't diminish it. But from a psychological breakdown perspective, this is heartbreaking. Because Snape never lived his own life. He spent decades as a ghost, haunting the memory of a woman who had moved on, built a life, loved someone else and died. She got to live at least for a while. Snape never did. He was emotionally dead from the moment Lily rejected him. Everything after that was just his body going through the motions. This brings us to a crucial question about the psychology community's understanding of love versus obsession. There's a fine line between devotion and pathology. Healthy love wants the best for the other person, even if that doesn't include you. Unhealthy love, what we might call obsessive love, can't separate your needs from theirs. It says, I need you to be happy, I need you to validate me, I need you to complete me. Snape's love for Lily had elements of both. He did want her safe, he did protect her son at great personal cost. But he also never let her go. He kept her frozen in his mind as a perfect ideal. He never allowed himself to see her as a complete person with flaws and complexity. He worshipped a memory, not a woman. And that's not love. That's idolatry. That's building your entire psychological temple around a ghost. Let's discuss the concept of the shadow self more deeply, because this is central to understanding Snape's psychology. Jung taught that the shadow contains not just negative traits but also positive qualities we've repressed. For Snape, his shadow held his capacity for joy, vulnerability, creativity, genuine connection. He repressed these because they felt too dangerous. Being happy meant risking loss. Being vulnerable meant risking rejection. Connecting with others meant risking abandonment. So he locked those parts of himself away and lived entirely in his shadow, the dark protective shell. He became what psychologists call defended. His cruelty, his coldness, his sarcasm, these were all armor. And armor is heavy. It protects you but it also imprisons you. Snape wore his armor so long he forgot there was a person underneath. Or maybe he was afraid to find out that person had died long ago. Now let's talk about what this means for us. Because Snape isn't just a fictional psychology case study. He represents patterns we see in real life all the time. How many people do you know who are still emotionally attached to someone from their past? Who make all their current relationships pay for old wounds? Who use cruelty as protection? Who can't forgive themselves for past mistakes? Who dedicate their lives to atonement instead of healing? The wounded lover archetype is everywhere. And the lesson isn't that love is dangerous. The lesson is that unprocessed trauma will poison everything in your life, including your capacity to love healthily. Here's what psychological disorders research tells us. Trauma doesn't heal with time. It heals with processing. You have to feel the feelings you've been avoiding. You have to grieve what you lost. You have to forgive yourself for being human and making mistakes. You have to integrate your shadow instead of letting it control you from the unconscious mind. Snape never did any of this. He chose suffering over healing, punishment over peace. And that's his true tragedy. Not that he loved and lost, but that he never allowed himself to recover from the loss. Let me share something about behavioral psychology that applies directly to Snape's story. There's a concept called learned helplessness. When people experience repeated trauma with no control, They eventually stop trying to escape even when escape becomes possible. They internalize, this is just how life is, this is what I deserve, there's no point in hoping for better. Snape exhibited learned helplessness. He had opportunities to build a different life. After Voldemort's first defeat, he could have left Britain, started over, pursued healing. But he didn't. He stayed at Hogwarts, surrounded by reminders of his failures, locked in his patterns. Because somewhere deep in his unconscious mind, he believed he deserved to suffer. And beliefs like that become self-fulfilling prophecies. Now some of you might be thinking, but Snape did redeem himself. He saved Harry. He helped defeat Voldemort. He died a hero. And yes, his actions were objectively good and brave. But here's what trauma psychology wants you to understand. Heroic actions don't automatically equal psychological healing. You can do good things for unhealthy reasons. You can save others while destroying yourself. Snape's heroism was real, but it wasn't redemption in the psychological sense. Redemption requires self-forgiveness, integration, the ability to see yourself as more than your worst mistake. Snape never got there. He died believing he was fundamentally unworthy, just slightly less guilty than before. That's not redemption. That's just a man who suffered less badly than he thought he deserved. Let's examine the final reveal, when Harry learns the truth about Snape through the memories. This is presented as a moment of redemption and understanding. Harry finally sees that Snape loved his mother, that everything Snape did was for her. And Harry honors this by naming his son after Snape, calling him the bravest man he ever knew. It's a beautiful moment. But let's analyze it through the lens of character study and psychological patterns. Does Harry's understanding actually change what Snape's life was? Does posthumous recognition heal decades of self-hatred and isolation? Snape died never knowing that anyone would understand or appreciate his sacrifice. He died alone, in pain, believing himself a monster. The fact that people eventually learn the truth is meaningful for others, but it didn't change his lived experience. And that's the cruel reality of the wounded lover archetype. Sometimes understanding comes too late to save the person who needed it most. Here's a question for you. What would psychological healing have actually looked like for Severus Snape? In Jungian analysis, it would mean confronting his shadow fully. Acknowledging, yes, I was abused as a child. Yes, I joined a terrorist organization. Yes, I loved someone who didn't love me back. Yes, I made terrible mistakes. Yes, I tried to atone. And then, the hardest part, yes, I deserve to be more than my trauma and my mistakes. I deserve peace. I deserve to be a whole person, not just a monument to suffering. It would mean allowing himself moments of joy without guilt. Forming real connections with people who could see him as he actually was. Processing his grief through therapy or at least honest conversation instead of just silently bleeding for decades. But that would require vulnerability. And vulnerability terrified Snape more than death. Think about the hidden mind concept in depth psychology. Most of our psychological patterns operate below conscious awareness. We're driven by beliefs we don't even know we have. For Snape, somewhere in his hidden mind there was a belief: I am unlovable. I am damaged. I am dangerous to those who get close to me. These beliefs, formed in childhood and reinforced by Lily's rejection, shaped every decision he made. They made him push people away. They made him embrace suffering. They made him incapable of accepting kindness or connection. And here's the devastating truth: beliefs like this are self-perpetuating. If you believe you're unlovable, you'll behave in ways that make people leave you, which confirms your belief, which reinforces the behavior. It's a psychological prison with invisible bars. Let's conclude by asking, what does Severus Snape teach us about the human mind? He shows us that trauma creates patterns that can last a lifetime if not addressed. That love without boundaries becomes obsession. That suffering doesn't equal redemption unless you actually heal the wounds. That you can do heroic things while still being psychologically fractured. That the shadow self, when unintegrated, will control your life from the darkness. That some people choose familiar pain over unknown healing because at least pain is predictable. Snape represents every person who gets stuck in their story, who can't move beyond the moment they were wounded, who builds their entire identity around suffering and loss. But here's what I want you to take away from this. You are not Severus Snape. You can choose differently. If you're carrying old wounds, you can process them instead of wearing them as armor. If you're stuck on someone from your past, you can grieve and let go instead of building shrines to ghosts. If you've made mistakes, you can forgive yourself instead of spending decades in self-punishment. The wounded lover archetype is a warning, not a destiny. It shows us what happens when we choose suffering over healing. When we let the unconscious mind run our lives. When we never integrate our shadow self. When we love the idea of someone more than we love our own wholeness. Severus Snape died as he lived, alone in pain, devoted to a memory. His story is tragic precisely because it didn't have to be this way. With different choices, with therapeutic intervention, with the courage to face his shadow and process his trauma, he could have had a life instead of just an existence. He could have been whole instead of broken. He could have known peace instead of just endless atonement. But he chose the wound. He chose the suffering. And in doing so, he became a perfect example of what happens when we let our past control our present and destroy our future. So I'll leave you with this question. What wounds are you carrying? What ghosts are you worshipping? What armor is imprisoning you? And most importantly, are you ready to choose healing over suffering? Because that's the real lesson of Severus Snape. Not that love is dangerous or that sacrifice is noble, but that unhealed trauma will consume your entire life if you let it. And you deserve better than that. We all do. If this video made you think differently about Snape, about psychology, about your own patterns, let me know in the comments. What's your take on the wounded lover archetype? Have you seen it in your own life or in people you know? And if you want more deep dives into fictional psychology using real psychological theory, make sure you're subscribed. Because we're just getting started exploring the hidden mind of the characters we love. Thanks for watching. And remember, understanding is the first step toward healing. Always.